I'm going to take everything from you, and then I'm leaving," Daniel said with a crooked smirk, like he had already won, like the outcome was decided long before I even knew we were playing a game. And for a moment, I just stood there in the middle of our kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between us, my fingers still wrapped around a ceramic coffee mug that had gone cold at least 20 minutes ago, staring at the man I had once trusted with every piece of my life. Every plan, every quiet dream I never said out loud. And I remember thinking, not that I was shocked, not even that I was hurt, but that something about the way he said it felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced that line in his head, maybe even in the mirror, waiting for the right moment to drop it on me like a final move in a game of chess he thought I didn't know we were playing. And he leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, watching me carefully, almost studying my reaction, like he expected tears or panic or maybe even begging. But I didn't give him any of that. I just tilted my head slightly and asked, quietly, "Everything?" And that single word seemed to amuse him more than anything else because he let out a short laugh, shaking his head like I was still the same naive woman he had underestimated for years, and he said, "The house, the accounts, the investments, you signed everything jointly. Emily, remember? You trusted me." And there it was, that word, trusted, delivered like a punchline, like trust itself was something foolish, something he had cleverly exploited rather than something we had built together, and I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that doesn't come from peace but from clarity. Because suddenly all the small things I had been noticing over the past few months started lining up in my mind like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't fully seen until now. The late nights he brushed off as work, the way he started taking calls in the garage, the new passwords on devices we used to share openly, the subtle shift in how he spoke to me, less like a partner and more like an inconvenience he was tolerating. And I remembered the first time it crossed my mind that something was wrong. A Tuesday evening in early spring when he came home smelling faintly of a cologne he didn't own, something sharper, unfamiliar, and when I asked about it, he laughed it off so easily that I almost felt embarrassed for even noticing. But that was the moment something changed inside me, something small but persistent, like a quiet voice that refused to be ignored, and instead of confronting him again, instead of starting a fight I couldn't yet prove I deserved to, when I did something he never expected. I started paying attention, not emotionally, but strategically. I watched patterns, I listened more than I spoke. I learned the rhythm of his new habits, and slowly, carefully, I began to understand that whatever he was planning, it wasn't impulsive, it was deliberate. And if he was preparing something, then I had time to prepare too. And now here he was, standing in front of me, delivering his grand reveal like it was the climax of a story he had been writing alone, completely unaware that I had been reading over his shoulder the entire time. And he pushed himself off the counter, walking a few steps closer, lowering his voice slightly, as if to emphasize the seriousness of what he was saying. "You really should have paid more attention, Emily," he added, almost casually, and I couldn't help but notice the irony in that sentence, because paying attention was exactly what I had been doing, just not in the way he assumed. And I set the coffee mug down gently on the counter, making sure my hands were steady, my expression neutral, because this moment wasn't about reacting. It was about timing, and timing, I had learned, was everything. And for a brief second, I let my eyes meet his, really meet them, searching for any trace of the man I had married, the one who used to laugh too loud at his own jokes and hold my hand during long drives even when no one was watching. But that version of him felt distant now, replaced by someone colder, more calculating, someone who saw this as a transaction rather than a betrayal. And maybe that was what finally made it easy, because when you realize the person standing in front of you is no longer the person you built your life with, you stop trying to save what's already gone, and instead, you start thinking about what comes next. And what came next, in that moment, wasn't anger or desperation. It was something far quieter and far more dangerous, certainty, because I already knew how this was going to end, just not in the way Daniel expected. And as he waited for my reaction, confident, almost impatient, like he wanted to enjoy the moment of my defeat, I reached for the edge of the counter, not to steady myself, but to anchor the calm I had built over weeks of quiet preparation. And I let out a small breath, not shaky, not weak, just controlled, before saying, "You really think you've thought of everything? don't you? And the way his smile widened told me everything I needed to know, because in his mind, this was already over, and that was exactly why he was about to lose. Daniel let out a low chuckle, shaking his head like my question only confirmed what he already believed, that I was still a step behind, still trying to catch up to something he had been planning for months. And he said, "I do not think, Emily, I know," drawing out the last word as if it carried weight, as if certainty itself belonged to him. And for a brief moment, I let the silence stretch between us again, not because I did not have anything to say, but because I understood something he clearly did not, that the most powerful move in any situation is not the loudest one. It is the one that comes after your opponent believes the game is over. And I could see it in the way he relaxed his shoulders, in the way his posture shifted from defensive to almost casual, like he was already stepping into the next chapter of his life, while I was still standing in what he assumed was the end of mine. And he moved past me toward the dining table where his phone was resting, picking it up and glancing at the screen briefly, probably expecting a message, maybe even waiting for confirmation from whoever else was involved in this plan of his. And that small detail did not go unnoticed because it matched what I had been quietly piecing together over the past several weeks, the pattern of messages that only came at certain hours, the way he would tilt his screen away just enough to block my view without making it obvious, the way he started locking doors that had never needed to be locked before. And it was not one single moment that gave everything away, it was the accumulation of them, the subtle shifts that most people would dismiss but that I chose to study instead. Because once you start looking at behavior instead of words, the truth becomes much harder to hide. And I remember sitting alone in the living room one night, the clock showing just past 11:30, while he was out, working late again, and instead of calling him or sending a message, I opened my laptop and began reviewing something I had not looked at in years, the financial records we had both signed off on without a second thought, because trust makes things easy, and easy is comfortable, and comfortable is exactly where mistakes are made. And as I scrolled through statements, transfers, and account changes, I started noticing discrepancies that did not match the story he had been telling me, small at first, almost insignificant, but consistent enough to form a pattern. And that was when I realized this was not just about leaving. It was about taking, about positioning himself to walk away with as much as possible while leaving me with as little as he could justify. And the moment that realization settled in, something inside me shifted permanently, not into panic, not into anger, but into focus. Because once you understand the rules someone else is playing by, you can decide whether to follow them or rewrite them entirely. And I chose the second option, and now, standing here in the same house where all of this had been quietly unfolding, I watched him set his phone back down and turn toward me again, clearly expecting some kind of reaction that still had not come. And that absence of reaction seemed to bother him more than anything I could have said, because he frowned slightly, just for a second, before masking it again with that same confident expression, and he said, "You are being very calm about this," almost like it was an accusation, and I let a small, measured smile form. Not enough to provoke him, just enough to make him question what he was missing, and I replied, "I have had some time to think," choosing each word carefully, because the truth is, I had not just been thinking, I had been preparing, and preparation does not look dramatic from the outside. It looks quiet, almost invisible, like nothing is happening at all, which is exactly why it works. And I remembered the day I decided to stop asking questions out loud and start answering them on my own. The day I sat across from someone who did not know me, someone who did not care about my feelings or my history, but understood the systems and structures that people like Daniel rely on when they believe they are being clever, and I listened more than I spoke, taking in every detail, every possibility, every outcome that could come from the choices already set in motion. Because if he had spent months building his version of the future, then I needed to build mine just as carefully, and maybe even more quietly. And as those weeks passed, I continued to play my role exactly the way he expected, attentive, trusting, unaware, because sometimes the best way to win is to let the other person believe you are not even trying. And I could tell now, by the way he was watching me, that he was starting to feel something he had not anticipated, not fear, not yet, but uncertainty, the kind that creeps in slowly when reality does not match expectation. And he crossed his arms again, this time not as relaxed as before, and said, "Thinking about what?" And I met his gaze without hesitation, because this was the moment where the balance began to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to make him realize that something was off. And I said, "About what happens after you walk out that door." And there was a pause, brief but noticeable, where his confidence flickered just slightly, and in that space, I understood that he had planned his exit. He had calculated his gain, but he had not fully considered the possibility that I had done the same. And that was the difference between us, because while he was focused on taking everything, I had been focused on making sure there was something. He could not take it all, something he did not even realize was already out of his reach. And as the weight of that realization began to settle, even if he could not yet articulate it, I knew we were no longer standing in the same version of this story, because he thought he was delivering the ending, but in reality, he had just stepped into the part where everything starts to unravel, and he did not even see it coming. For a split second, Daniel did not respond, and that silence was subtle but meaningful because it was the first crack in the version of control he believed he had, and I could see his mind working behind his eyes, trying to recalculate, trying to figure out what exactly I meant and whether it mattered. And then he exhaled lightly, dismissing it with a small shrug like he had decided it was nothing worth worrying about. And he said, "After I walk out, you mean after I move on," correcting my wording as if that distinction somehow kept him in control, and he picked up his phone again, tapping the screen absent-mindedly. But this time his attention was not fully on it. Part of him remained focused on me, waiting, measuring. And that was exactly the kind of split attention that leads people to miss important details. And I let that moment breathe, not rushing to fill it, because tension, when left alone, tends to grow on its own. And I turned slightly toward the window, letting my gaze drift outside for just a second, as if I was thinking about something far away, when in reality I was choosing my next words with precision, because everything from this point forward needed to land exactly where I intended, not too early, not too obvious, just enough to guide him toward the realization he had not prepared for. And I said, "You have been planning this for a while," not as a question, but as a statement. And he smirked again, more confidently this time, relieved to be back on ground he thought he understood, and he replied, "Of course I have. You do not make moves like this overnight." And there was that word again, moves, like this was strategy, like this was a game, and in a way it was, just not one he fully understood, and I nodded slightly, acknowledging his answer, because agreement can be more disarming than resistance, and I continued, "Then you also know that plans only work if nothing changes." And that made him pause again, just briefly, his fingers hovering over his phone screen before lowering it back onto the table, his full attention returning to me now, because something in that sentence did not sit right with him. And he said, "Nothing has changed," a little too quickly, a little too firmly, like he was trying to convince both of us at the same time. And I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it confirmed what I already knew, that he was operating on assumptions that were no longer accurate. And I turned back toward him fully, meeting his eyes again, and for the first time since he walked into the kitchen, there was no softness in my expression, only clarity. And I said, "That is where you are wrong." And the words hung in the air between us, heavier than anything I had said before, and I could see the shift happen, subtle but undeniable, his posture tightening, his shoulders no longer relaxed, his stance no longer casual, because certainty had started to give way to something else, something less comfortable. And he let out a short breath through his nose, almost like a laugh, but without any real amusement behind it, and said, "You are trying to scare me." But there was a question hidden underneath that statement, one he did not want to ask directly. And I shook my head slightly, not dismissively, but calmly, and replied, "No, Daniel, if I wanted to scare you, I would have done that weeks ago." And that was the first time I referenced the timeline out loud. The first time I let him understand that this was not a reaction to what he had just said. This was something that had been unfolding long before this moment. And that was when his expression changed more noticeably. The confidence not gone, but no longer effortless, and he narrowed his eyes slightly, studying me now the way I had been studying him for weeks, trying to read something he could not quite place. And he asked, "What are you talking about?" And there it was, the question he did not want to ask, finally spoken. And I took a step toward the table, not closing the distance between us completely, just enough to shift the dynamic, to show that I was not retreating, not backing down, and I rested my hand lightly on the edge of the chair, grounding myself in the moment, and I said, I am talking about the fact that you think this is the moment everything changes, but for me, that moment already happened. And as I spoke, I could feel the memory of that shift clearly. The night everything stopped being about trust and started being about truth. The moment I realized that waiting for answers was no longer an option, that I had to go find them myself, and once I did, once the pieces came together in a way that could not be ignored, there was no going back to the version of me that believed in what we had without question, and I could see that he was trying to connect what I was saying to something concrete, something he could understand and control, but the more he tried, the more uncertain he became, because uncertainty is not just about not knowing. It is about realizing that what you thought you knew might be wrong, and that is a much harder thing to face. And he ran a hand through his hair, a small gesture, but one I had seen many times before when something did not go according to his expectations. And he said, "You are overthinking this." But his voice lacked the confidence it had just minutes ago, and I did not argue with him. I did not correct him, because sometimes letting someone hold on to a false assumption for a little longer makes the eventual truth hit harder. And instead, I simply said, maybe, allowing the possibility to exist without confirming it. And then I reached toward the counter, my fingers brushing against something just out of his line of sight, something I had placed there earlier without drawing attention to it, something that had been waiting for the right moment just as much as I had, and I felt the weight of it under my hand, not heavy, but significant, because it represented more than just what it contained. It represented every decision I had made quietly, every step I had taken without his knowledge, every moment I chose not to react but to prepare, and I did not pick it up yet, not fully, just enough to let my fingers rest against it, because timing still mattered, and this was not the moment to reveal everything, not yet, but it was the moment to let him feel that something was coming, something he had not accounted for. And as I looked back at him, I could see it clearly now, that shift from certainty to suspicion, from control to questioning, and I knew that whatever he thought this conversation was going to be, it was already becoming something else entirely, something he could not predict, and that was exactly where I needed him to be. Daniel followed my hand without meaning to, his eyes flicking toward the edge of the counter where my fingers rested, and I saw it register in real time. That small, instinctive reaction people have when they sense something just outside their understanding, and he straightened slightly, his voice sharper now as he said, "What is that?" And for a brief moment I let my gaze drop to it as well, as if I had just remembered it was there, as if it had not been part of this moment from the beginning, and I said, "Just something I should have looked at sooner," keeping my tone even, almost reflective, and that answer did not satisfy him, not even close, because uncertainty has a way of making people impatient, and he took a step closer, his focus no longer split, fully locked onto whatever it was he thought he might be missing, and he said, "Emily, what did you do?" And there it was again, that assumption that any shift in control had to come from something I had done wrong, something impulsive or emotional. And I almost found it ironic, because if there was one thing I had learned over the past few weeks, it was that the most effective moves are the ones that look like nothing at all until they are already in motion. And I lifted my hand slightly, finally picking up the envelope that had been sitting there quietly, plain, unmarked, the kind of thing you could easily overlook if you were not paying attention, and I held it between us without offering it yet, just letting it exist in the space, letting him see that there was something tangible now, something real, and I said, "I paid attention." And those 3 words carried more weight than anything else I had said so far, because they were not just an answer, they were a correction, a direct contradiction to the version of me he had built his plan around. And I could see the shift hit him harder this time, his jaw tightening slightly, his eyes narrowing not in confidence but in calculation, because now he was trying to bridge the gap between what he believed and what was unfolding in front of him. And that gap was getting wider by the second, and he reached out, not forcefully, just enough to indicate he wanted the envelope, and said, "Give it to me." And for a second I did not move, not to resist, not to provoke, but to remind him, silently, that control of this moment no longer belonged to him. And then I placed it in his hand, calmly, deliberately, watching as his fingers closed around it. And for the first time since he walked into the room, there was no trace of a smile on his face, only focus, only the quiet tension of someone who realizes they might have overlooked something important. And he turned the envelope over once, as if expecting something written on it, some kind of clue. But there was nothing, just a simple seal, and that seemed to unsettle him even more, because it meant whatever was inside was meant to speak for itself. And he glanced up at me briefly, searching for any hint, any signal, but I gave him nothing, just the same steady expression. And finally, he opened it, sliding a set of papers out with a controlled motion that betrayed none of the urgency building underneath. And as his eyes moved across the first page, I watched the exact moment everything began to shift, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, undeniable increments. The slight pause where his eyes stopped moving, the subtle tightening around them, the way his grip on the papers adjusted as if he needed to hold them more firmly to keep them steady. And he flipped to the next page, faster this time, then the next, each movement less controlled than the last, and the silence stretched between us again, but it was no longer the same kind of silence from before. It was heavier now, filled with the weight of something he had not expected to see. And I let him read. I did not interrupt, because this was not about what I said. It was about what he was realizing on his own, and realization, when it comes from within, is much harder to dismiss. And after what felt like a long moment, but was probably only a few seconds, he looked up, his expression no longer confident, no longer certain, but not fully defeated either, caught somewhere in between as he tried to process what he was holding. And he said, "This does not make sense," almost to himself, like he was trying to reconcile it with the version of reality he had built. And I tilted my head slightly, not in confusion but in quiet acknowledgement, and replied, "It does if you look at the dates." And that was when he looked back down, more carefully this time, more deliberately, scanning the details he had rushed past the first time, and I could see it happening. The connections forming, the timeline shifting in his mind as he realized that what he thought was recent, what he thought he had control over, had actually changed long before he made his move. And he ran a hand through his hair again, slower this time, his thoughts clearly catching up to him. And he said, "When did you do this?" And there was something different in his voice now, not just confusion but a hint of something deeper, something closer to disbelief. And I met his gaze without hesitation and said, "Around the time you started staying late at the office," letting the answer settle, letting him connect the dots between his actions and mine. Because this was never about reacting to him. It was about responding in a way he could not anticipate. And he looked back down at the papers again, as if hoping they would say something different the second time. But they did not, because facts do not change just because someone is not ready to accept them. And as the weight of that realization began to settle in, I could see the final piece fall into place, the understanding that whatever plan he had built, whatever outcome he had expected, was no longer guaranteed. And for the first time since this conversation began, he was not the one setting the pace, not the one controlling the direction. And that shift, quiet as it was, changed everything. Daniel kept staring at the papers as if the answers might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough, his eyes moving back and forth across the lines with a kind of urgency he had not shown before. And I could tell he was no longer reading for confirmation but searching for a mistake, something he could point to and say, "This does not count. This does not change anything." But the longer he looked, the more that possibility slipped away, and he let out a slow breath, lowering the pages slightly before lifting his gaze back to me. And this time there was no trace of that earlier confidence, only a measured tension as he said, "You moved the accounts." And I nodded once, not as a triumph, but as a simple acknowledgement of fact. And he added quickly, without telling me, as if that part mattered more than the outcome, as if transparency would somehow undo what had already been done. And I replied, I used the authority we both agreed to, keeping my tone steady, because this was not about emotion. It was about structure, about the systems he had relied on working exactly the way he expected, and the realization that they had worked differently for me was what unsettled him most. And he shook his head slightly, almost in disbelief, flipping back to the first page as if retracing his steps might lead him to a different conclusion. And he said, "This does not cover everything." And there it was, the shift from certainty to negotiation, from knowing to hoping, and I let a small pause sit between us before answering, because timing still mattered, and I said, "No, it does not." And that seemed to give him a brief sense of footing again, a small piece of ground to stand on, and he straightened just a little, his voice regaining a hint of strength as he said, "Then you did not stop anything, Emily. You just complicated it." And for a moment, I let him have that. Let him believe that the situation was still something he could untangle, because sometimes people need to walk a little further into their own assumptions before they are ready to see what is actually there. And I nodded slightly, almost thoughtfully, and said, "If that is how you want to look at it." And that answer did not challenge him directly, but it did not support him either. It simply existed, leaving space for doubt to grow, and I could see it happening again, that subtle tightening in his expression, that hesitation just beneath the surface. And he glanced down at the papers once more, then back at me, as if trying to decide whether to push further or change direction, and he chose to push, saying, "You think this gives you leverage?" And I met his gaze without hesitation, because this was not about what I thought, it was about what was already true, and I replied, "I think it changes the outcome." And those words landed differently, because they did not argue, they did not accuse, they simply reframed the entire situation. And I could see the impact in the way he exhaled, slower this time, his shoulders no longer squared but slightly lowered, as if the weight of what he was processing had finally settled in. And he looked past me for a second, his eyes unfocused, like he was running through scenarios in his mind, recalculating, adjusting, trying to find a version of events where he still came out ahead. And that was when I realized something important, that his confidence had never been about certainty, it had been about control, about believing he understood every variable in the equation. And now that one of those variables had changed without his knowledge, the entire structure he built around it was beginning to shift, and he ran his hand along the edge of the table, a small, grounding motion, before saying, "You should have talked to me." And that sentence hung in the air for a moment, not because it was surprising, but because of what it revealed, that even now, he was framing this as a communication issue, as if the problem was not what he had planned, but how I had responded to it. And I took a small breath before answering, not because I needed time, but because I wanted the words to land exactly where they needed to, and I said, "Would it have changed anything?" And that question did not come with an edge, it was not confrontational, it was simple, direct, and it left no room for deflection. And he opened his mouth slightly as if to respond, but nothing came out right away, because the answer, whatever it was, required him to acknowledge something he had been avoiding. And after a brief pause, he said, "That is not the point," but the hesitation before it said otherwise. And I let that sit for a moment before adding, "It is exactly the point." And there was no anger in my voice, no raised tone, just clarity, because the truth does not need volume to be heard. And I could see it in his expression, the way his eyes shifted slightly, the way his jaw tightened again, not in frustration this time, but in recognition, because whether he admitted it or not, he knew the answer. He knew that a conversation would not have changed what he intended to do. And that meant my response, quiet as it had been, was not the cause of this situation, it was the result of it. And as that realization settled in, the dynamic between us shifted once more, not dramatically, but enough to make it clear that we were no longer standing on equal ground. And he looked down at the papers again, more slowly this time, as if accepting that they were not going to change. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more measured, as he said, "What else did you do?" And there was no accusation in that question, only a quiet acknowledgement that what he was holding was not the full picture. And I met his gaze, steady and unhurried, because this was the moment where the next layer began to surface. And I said, "Enough to make sure I am not left with nothing." And I let that answer settle without elaborating, because the details were not the point yet. The point was the understanding, the shift in perspective that was still unfolding. And as I watched him process that, I knew that whatever confidence he had walked into this room with was no longer intact, replaced instead by something far less certain. And that change, quiet as it was, marked the beginning of an outcome he had never planned for. Daniel did not respond right away, and that hesitation stretched longer than any silence we had shared so far, because this time it was not filled with confidence or calculation. It was filled with realization, slow and unavoidable. and I could see it in the way his grip on the papers loosened slightly, the way his shoulders no longer held that rigid sense of control he had walked in with. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more measured, as if he was choosing each word carefully now instead of delivering them like conclusions. And he said, "You are trying to protect yourself." And there was something different in that statement. Not dismissive, not mocking, just an observation he was still trying to understand. And I nodded once, because there was no reason to deny it. And I said, "Yes," keeping it simple, because the simplicity of truth often carries more weight than anything else. And he let out a slow breath, looking down at the papers again before setting them on the table, flattening them with his palm as if grounding them would somehow stabilize the situation. And he said, "You should have trusted me." And that sentence lingered in the air, not because it was surprising, but because of how disconnected it was from everything that had already been revealed. And I watched him for a moment, not reacting immediately, because sometimes people say things not to convince others but to reassure themselves. And I wondered if he even believed that anymore, or if it was just something he felt he needed to say. And I tilted my head slightly before answering, my tone still calm, still steady, and I said, "I did." And that response seemed to catch him off guard, not because of the words themselves, but because of how easily they came, without hesitation, without defensiveness. And I continued, "For a long time, I did," letting that part settle before adding anything else, because context matters. And he looked at me more closely now, as if trying to reconcile that statement with everything that had happened. And I went on, "But trust is not something that stays the same when the behavior behind it changes." And there was no accusation in my voice, just a clear line drawn between what was and what is. And I could see the shift in his expression again, not sharp, not dramatic, but present, as if part of him understood exactly what I meant even if he did not want to fully acknowledge it. And he exhaled slowly, running his hand along the back of his neck this time, a gesture I had seen often when something unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. And he said, "You think I was planning this all along?" And I did not rush to answer, because that question carried more than one layer. And I said, "I think you started planning something the moment you stopped including me in it." And that distinction mattered, because it was not about assigning a timeline to his intentions. It was about recognizing the shift in his actions. And he did not respond immediately, his gaze drifting slightly to the side, as if replaying something in his mind. And for a brief moment, the tension in the room felt different, less confrontational and more reflective, like we were both looking at the same situation from different points in time. And then he straightened slightly, as if pulling himself back into the present, and said, "You are making this bigger than it is." But the conviction behind that statement was weaker now, less certain, and I did not challenge it directly. I did not argue, because the truth had already been established in ways that did not require further debate. And instead I said, "I am looking at it as it is." And that was enough, because reality does not need to be exaggerated to have impact. It simply needs to be seen clearly. And he nodded slowly, almost reluctantly, as if part of him recognized that clarity even if he was not ready to fully accept it. And he glanced at the envelope again, then back at me, and said, "You said this is not everything." And I could hear the shift in his tone, the move from denial to inquiry, from resisting the situation to trying to understand it. And I said, "It is not," confirming what he already knew. And he paused, studying me again, more carefully. This time, not with the confidence of someone who believes they are ahead, but with the attention of someone who realizes they might be behind. And he asked, "So what else is there?" And that question carried a different kind of weight now, not demanding, not entitled, just searching. And I took a small breath, not because I needed it, but because this was the moment where the next layer would begin to unfold, and timing still mattered. And I said, "The part you never accounted for," letting the words settle before continuing. "The part where I do not wait for things to happen to me." And I could see the impact of that immediately, not as a dramatic reaction, but as a quiet shift in understanding. Because for the first time, he was not just reacting to what I had done, he was starting to understand why I had done it. And that understanding changed the dynamic in a way that no document or statement could on its own. And he looked at me for a long moment, his expression no longer defensive, no longer confident, but something in between, something more uncertain. And I realized then that whatever version of control he thought he had when he walked into this room was no longer something he could rely on, because the situation had moved beyond his expectations, beyond his calculations, and into something he had not prepared for. And as that realization settled between us, quiet but undeniable, I knew that the next step would not be about proving anything further. It would be about showing him just how much of this had already changed without him ever noticing. And that was a shift he could not undo. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, his eyes searching mine as if he was trying to find something familiar to hold on to, something that would bring the situation back to the version he understood. But whatever he was looking for was not there anymore, and I could see the realization settling in slowly, not as a sudden shock, but as a gradual shift, like the ground beneath him had changed just enough to make every step uncertain. And he let out a quiet breath before saying, "You are acting like you already won." And there was no anger in his voice, just a quiet observation, almost cautious, and I did not answer right away because this was not about declaring anything. It was about letting him come to his own conclusions, and I took a small step back from the table, creating a little more space between us, not out of distance but out of control, because space has a way of changing perspective. And I said, "This is not about winning," keeping my tone even, measured, and he gave a slight shake of his head, as if he did not quite believe that, and replied, "Then what is it about?" And that question lingered between us, heavier than it sounded, because it carried everything that had led to this moment, every assumption, every decision, every quiet shift that neither of us had fully acknowledged until now. And I met his gaze and said, "It is about not losing everything because I trusted the wrong version of you." And those words landed differently, not sharp, not aggressive, but undeniable, and I could see it in the way his expression changed, the way his eyes flickered slightly, as if something in that sentence reached a part of him he had not prepared to confront, and he looked away briefly, his attention drifting to the papers on the table, then back to me. And he said, "You are making it sound like I am the only one who changed." And there was something defensive in that statement, something that suggested he was trying to balance the narrative again, trying to regain some control over how this story was being framed. And I did not dismiss it. I did not argue against it directly, because the truth was more complex than that. And I said, "We both changed," allowing that acknowledgement to exist, because it was real, but I did not stop there, and I continued. "The difference is, I changed because I had to understand what was happening, and you changed because you thought I would never notice." And that distinction settled between us, quiet but sharp, and I could see the impact in the way he inhaled slightly, as if preparing to respond, but then paused, because there was no easy way to argue with something that had already been demonstrated, not just said. And he shifted his weight slightly, his posture no longer as steady as before, and, for a brief moment, the room felt different, less like a confrontation and more like a realization unfolding in real time. And then he straightened again, as if trying to reclaim some sense of direction, and said, "Even if that is true, you still cannot stop everything." And there it was, that last piece of confidence, smaller now, but still present, holding on to the idea that there was something left he could control, something he could still walk away with. And I nodded slowly, acknowledging that possibility without denying it. And I said, "You are right." And that seemed to catch him off guard again, because agreement was not what he expected, and I continued, "I cannot stop everything," letting that settle before adding, "But I can decide what you do not get to take." And that shift in framing changed the weight of the situation once more, because it was no longer about preventing loss entirely. It was about controlling what remained, and I could see that realization land, subtle but clear, in the way his eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion this time, but in understanding. And he glanced down at the envelope again, then back at me, and said, "There is more," not as a question, but as a statement. And I held his gaze for a moment before nodding once, because at this point, there was no need to pretend otherwise, and I said, "There is always more when someone starts planning without telling you." And that answer carried a quiet finality, because it was not just about the documents in his hand, it was about everything that had led to them, everything that had been set in motion long before this conversation began. And he let out a slow breath, running his hand along his jaw as if trying to process the full scope of what he was now facing. And I could see it clearly. The shift from trying to control the situation to trying to understand it, from assuming he was ahead to realizing he might not be. And that realization did not come with a dramatic reaction. It came with a quiet tension, a stillness that replaced the earlier certainty. And as he stood there, holding the papers that had already changed part of the outcome, I knew that the next step would not be about proving anything further. It would be about showing him just how much of the story had already been rewritten without him ever noticing. And that was a truth he could no longer ignore, no matter how much he might want to. Daniel's eyes lingered on me a second longer, then drifted back down to the papers as if they were the only solid thing left in a room that no longer followed the rules he thought it did. And I could see him recalculating again, not with the same confidence as before, but with a quieter urgency, like someone trying to rebuild a structure that had already begun to collapse in ways he did not expect. And he said, "You are saying I do not get to decide how this ends." And there was something in his voice that had shifted from certainty to negotiation, from declaration to interpretation, and I did not answer immediately, because the truth of that statement was not something that needed to be rushed. It needed to settle, to be understood, and I walked past the edge of the table slowly, not turning my back to him completely, but moving just enough to change the angle between us, to break the direct line of confrontation into something more controlled. And I said, "You already made your decisions," keeping my tone even, grounded, and I let a small pause follow before adding, "I just made mine after I understood them." And that distinction mattered, because it reframed everything from reaction to response, from emotion to intention, and I could see that land in the way his expression tightened slightly, not in anger but in recognition, because there is a difference between being opposed and being outmaneuvered, and he was starting to feel the latter, and he set the papers down, more carefully this time, aligning the edges against the table as if creating order in something that no longer felt orderly. And he said, "So what happens now?" And that question, simple as it sounded, carried more weight than anything else he had said, because it was no longer about defending what he had planned. It was about trying to understand what was still possible. And I leaned lightly against the counter, not as a retreat, but as a steady point. And I said, "Now, we deal with what is real, not what you expected." And he let out a breath, slower this time, his shoulders lowering just slightly as if the resistance he had been holding was beginning to ease into acceptance, even if he was not fully there yet. And he nodded once, almost to himself, before looking back at me and saying, "You changed the structure." And I did not correct him, because he was not wrong, but I added quietly, "I worked within it, just like you did." And that parallel seemed to settle something for him, not resolve it, but clarify it, because it removed the idea that this was something unfair or unexpected and replaced it with the reality that it was simply a different use of the same system. And he stood there for a moment, silent again. But this silence was different from the others. It was not tense or uncertain. It was reflective, like he was finally seeing the full picture rather than just the part he had focused on before. And then he asked, "Was there ever a moment you were going to tell me?" And that question came softer, not defensive, not accusatory, just honest in a way he had not been earlier. And I considered it for a second before answering, because the truth was not complicated, it was just not comfortable. And I said, "There was a moment I thought you would tell me first." And that answer stayed with him. I could see it in the way his gaze dropped briefly, the way his jaw shifted as if he was holding back a response that no longer felt as certain as it might have earlier. And he nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging something he had not wanted to fully face. And then he looked back up and said, "And when I did not." And I finished the thought calmly. I stopped waiting. And that was it. Simple, direct, and it carried the entire weight of the shift that had happened between us, because it was not just about this situation. It was about the point where expectation ended and action began. And he exhaled again, this time longer, his posture settling into something more grounded, less defensive, less controlled. And he glanced once more at the envelope, then at the papers, then back at me, and said, "You planned this carefully." And there was no edge to it, no accusation, just a statement of fact. And I met his gaze and said, "I paid attention long enough to understand what needed to be done." And that answer did not elevate what I had done. It simply described it, because this was never about being clever. It was about being aware. And as that realization settled in, I could see the final shift take place, not dramatic, not visible in any single movement, but present in the way he stood, in the way he looked at me, in the absence of the confidence he had walked in with, replaced now by something quieter, something more grounded in reality. And for the first time since this conversation began, there was no attempt to regain control, no attempt to redirect the outcome. Only the acknowledgement that the outcome was no longer his to define alone, and that understanding, quiet as it was, marked the moment where everything he had assumed about how this would end finally gave way to what it had become, something he had not planned, something he had not expected, but something he could no longer ignore. Daniel remained still for a moment after my last words settled, as if the space between us had finally shifted into something neither of us could reshape any further. And I could see it clearly now, not just in his posture or his expression, but in the absence of resistance, the absence of that need to redirect or regain control that had defined everything he said at the beginning. And he looked at me with a kind of quiet understanding that had not been there before, and he said, "So this is it." Not as a question, not even as a statement, but as a recognition of something already decided. And I did not rush to respond because moments like that do not need to be filled immediately. They need to be allowed to exist, and I took a slow breath, letting the weight of everything that had unfolded settle into something steady rather than overwhelming, and I said, "This is the part where things stop being assumptions and start being real." And he nodded slightly, almost reflexively, as if that made sense even if it was not what he wanted. And he glanced around the kitchen briefly, his eyes moving over familiar details like he was seeing them differently now, not as things he owned or controlled, but as parts of a life that was no longer structured the way he believed it was. And he said, "I thought I had more time." And there was something honest in that admission, something that stripped away the strategy and left only the reality of how he had approached everything. And I answered simply, "So did I." Because that was true in its own way, just from a different perspective, and that shared acknowledgement, quiet as it was, seemed to settle something between us, not resolve it, but clarify it. And he looked back at the papers one more time before pushing them, slightly toward the center of the table, as if physically placing them there was a way of accepting what they represented, and he said, "You did not react the way I expected," and I let a small pause follow that before replying. "That is because I stopped reacting when I realized what was happening." And he nodded again, slower this time, like he was absorbing not just the words but the meaning behind them. And there was no argument, no attempt to challenge that, because it was no longer about convincing each other of anything. It was about understanding what had already changed, and he straightened slightly, not with the confidence he had before, but with a quieter kind of resolve, and he said, "I guess I underestimated you." And I met his gaze steadily, not with satisfaction, not with resentment, just with clarity, and I said, "You underestimated the situation." Because it was never just about me. It was about the assumptions he built everything on, and he exhaled slowly, almost like a small release. And for the first time since this conversation began, there was no tension in that breath, just acceptance. And he looked toward the door for a moment, then back at me, and there was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, not heavy, just final. And in that silence, everything that needed to be said had already been said. Everything that needed to be understood was already in place. And he gave a small nod, almost to himself, before saying, "I will figure out what comes next." And there was no challenge in that, no hidden meaning, just a statement of what he would have to do moving forward. And I nodded once in return, because that part was no longer something I needed to be involved in. And as he reached for his phone and then stepped toward the hallway, I did not stop him. I did not say anything else, because there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to clarify, and I watched as he moved through a space that had once been shared in a very different way, now defined by the choices we had both made. And when he reached the doorway, he paused briefly, not turning back, just standing there for a second, as if acknowledging the shift without needing to say it out loud. And then he continued forward, leaving the room quieter than before, but not empty, just different. And I stood there for a moment longer, letting the stillness settle into something steady, something grounded, and I looked at the envelope on the counter, now empty, no longer just a symbol of preparation but of completion, of a process that had unfolded exactly the way it needed to. And I realized then that what mattered most was not what had been taken or what had been protected, but the fact that I had not allowed myself to remain in a position where I had no say in how things ended. And that clarity, simple as it was, carried more weight than anything else, because it marked the point where the story stopped being about what was done to me and became about what I chose to do in response. And as I picked up the envelope and set it aside, I felt a quiet sense of certainty settle in, not about what would happen next, but about the fact that whatever it would not be defined by someone else's plan. And that, more than anything else, was what truly changed everything.